It was late in the evening at Woodmere Plaza, the shopping mall where Terrence worked as a janitor. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh, bright glow over the marble floors, which he was meticulously scrubbing, his routine blending with the quiet buzz of the near-empty space. The last shoppers were leaving, and Terrence took pride in his work, ensuring each tile gleamed. He had been working at the mall for nearly 2 years, and while it wasn't the most glamorous job, he took it seriously. He believed in leaving every corner spotless. But that night, something was different. A lingering presence hung over him, a faint prickling at the back of his neck. He shook it off, chalking it up to the exhaustion that sometimes settled in at the end of a long shift. He went back to mopping, his movements rhythmic and practiced. Suddenly, he heard the sound of high heels clicking behind him, sharp and determined. He turned, spotting a woman watching him intently from a few feet away. She was tall, with a severe expression, her platinum blonde hair pulled tightly back. Her gaze was piercing and unnervingly focused on him, almost like she was sizing him up. She was holding a small dog under her arm, a furry creature with a jeweled collar, and her designer handbag dangled from her other arm. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice as cold as her gaze. "What do you think you're doing here?" Terrence blinked, taken aback. Just cleaning, ma'am," he replied, forcing a polite smile. "I'm the janitor here." The woman scoffed, rolling her eyes in disdain. "Are you supposed to be here right now? Because I find it very suspicious, a man like you wandering around here this late." Terrence's smile faded. He had seen her type before, people who looked at him and made quick, harsh judgments. "Yes, ma'am, I'm scheduled to work late tonight. I'm just doing my job." She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Well, I don't trust you. I'm a tenant here, and I don't think you have any business being here this late. You could be doing anything, stealing, damaging property." Terrence felt a spark of irritation but kept his cool. "I can assure you, ma'am, I'm just doing my job. If you'd like, I can call my supervisor to confirm." She waved her hand dismissively. "Supervisor or not, I don't like you being here. I don't feel safe." Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper, and she clutched her purse a little tighter, her eyes flashing with something close to contempt. Terrence felt the tension building and took a step back, sensing her hostility growing. He wanted to de-escalate the situation, but before he could say another word, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a small canister. Without warning, she aimed it at him, her finger pressing down on the nozzle. A burst of pepper spray hit Terrence square in the face, his eyes stinging immediately. The sudden, intense pain was overwhelming, and he dropped his mop, his hands going to his face as he stumbled back. He could hear her mocking laugh through the haze of pain. "This is what happens to criminals like you," she sneered, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "I'm protecting myself. Who knows what you could have done?" Terrence struggled to catch his breath, his vision blurred and his skin burning. He could barely see her through his tears, but he could hear the click of her heels as she walked away, leaving him gasping on the floor. The pain was excruciating, and he was still reeling from the shock of the attack. His mind raced as he tried to understand what had just happened. Another mall employee, Carlos, heard the commotion and rushed over. He stopped short when he saw Terrence on the ground, clutching his face in agony. "Terrence. Man, what happened?" Carlos asked, dropping to his knees beside him. Some woman," Terrence managed to gasp, his voice hoarse and strained. "She pepper-sprayed me, for no reason." Carlos's eyes widened in shock and anger as he looked around. "Are you serious? She just attacked you?" Terrence nodded, still fighting through the pain. Carlos helped him to his feet, his hand resting supportively on his shoulder. "Come on, let's get you to the security office," Carlos said, his tone grim. "They've got cameras everywhere in this mall. She can't just get away with this." As they made their way to the security office, Terrence's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't believe that this woman had attacked him simply for doing his job, simply for existing in a space she didn't think he belonged in. The pain was beginning to subside slightly, but his eyes were still stinging, and the humiliation and anger were just as sharp. The head of mall security, Officer Lewis, looked up as they entered, his brow furrowing as he took in Terrence's condition. "What happened here?" Carlos jumped in, explaining the situation, his voice tight with frustration. "Some woman just pepper-sprayed him. He was just doing his job, and she attacked him." Lewis frowned, nodding as he listened. "Let's check the security footage. We'll see who this woman is, and if she's still in the building, we can detain her until the police arrive." They huddled around the monitors as Lewis rewound the footage from earlier that evening. Terrence watched as the scene played out on the screen, his heart pounding as he relived the attack. The camera captured every moment, the woman approaching him, her aggressive stance, the pepper spray glinting in her hand before she unleashed it on him. "There she is," Lewis muttered, zooming in on the woman's face. He jotted down her description, his expression growing more serious. "We've got her on camera. She's wearing a white coat, carrying a dog, and her face is clear enough for identification." Carlos nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to find her before she leaves the mall. She can't just walk away after doing something like this." Lewis nodded, his eyes hard. "Let's get the police involved right now. Terrence, are you okay to give a statement?" Terrence took a shaky breath, nodding. He was still reeling from the pain, but he knew he couldn't let this go. This was more than just an assault, it was a blatant act of discrimination, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. As Lewis called the police, Carlos stayed by Terrence's side, a look of determination on his face. "Don't worry, man. We're not letting her get away with this. People need to know what she did." Terrence nodded, grateful for the support. He knew he wasn't alone in this, and that gave him strength. He was ready to fight back, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been mistreated for reasons they couldn't control. This was just the beginning. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the storefronts and marble floors. Terrence was seated in the security office, the lingering sting from the pepper spray still a sharp reminder of the recent encounter. Officer Lewis led the two responding officers into the room, a man and a woman, each wearing a determined look. They listened closely as Terrence recounted the incident, nodding and taking notes as he described the woman's unprovoked attack. After he finished, the female officer, Officer Daniels, looked at him with compassion in her eyes. "I'm so sorry you went through that, Mr. Moore. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially when you're just doing your job." Terrence gave a small nod, his face still tense with residual pain and frustration. "Thank you, officer. I can't believe someone would do something like this over me just cleaning the floors." Officer Lewis took over, explaining what they'd gathered from the security footage. "We've reviewed the footage and identified the woman's appearance, including her clothing and the small dog she was carrying. It's clear that this was a targeted, unprovoked attack." Officer Grant, the other officer, adjusted his radio. "Based on the video, it looks like she headed toward the mall's east exit. We'll sweep the area and see if we can locate her. She might still be around." Terrence leaned forward, his hands clenched. "Please, just, don't let her get away with this. She can't just treat people like that." "We won't," Officer Daniels assured him. "We'll do everything we can to make sure justice is served." Meanwhile, Officer Grant went back to the surveillance monitors, studying the footage for any clues that might point to where the woman went next. Lewis rewound the video, and they watched as she walked briskly through the shopping center, heading toward the east wing. Her demeanor was calm, almost smug, as if she felt completely justified in what she'd done. The sight of her arrogant stride filled Terrence with fresh anger, but he kept it bottled up, waiting to see what the officers would do. Carlos, who had stayed with Terrence since the incident, gave him a supportive nod. "Don't worry, man. She's not getting away with this. The footage doesn't lie." After a quick review, Officer Grant turned to his partner. "Let's head toward the east wing. If she's still in the building, we'll find her." The officers left the security office, with Lewis remaining behind to reassure Terrence and Carlos. "You both did the right thing by reporting this immediately," he said firmly. "If there's anything more you remember, no matter how small, let us know." Terrence nodded, feeling slightly more reassured. "Thank you, Officer Lewis. I hope she realizes what she did was wrong." Carlos placed a hand on Terrence's shoulder. "She will, man. People like that, they think they can get away with anything. But she picked the wrong place to pull this." Outside, Officers Daniels and Grant made their way through the nearly empty corridors of the mall. Most stores were closed, their gates pulled down, leaving the mall eerily quiet except for the muffled sound of their footsteps. They reached the east wing exit, which opened onto a dimly lit parking garage. Officer Daniels took out her flashlight, casting it over the rows of parked cars. "If she left through here, she couldn't have gotten far." Grant nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "She may be trying to hide somewhere close by. Let's check each row. Maybe she panicked and doubled back." They moved methodically through the parking lot, their flashlights sweeping over each car. The tension was thick, and both officers were on high alert. Then, just as they reached the end of the row, they heard the faint sound of footsteps. Officer Daniels held up a hand, signaling for silence. The footsteps were light, almost hesitant, and coming from behind a nearby SUV. They crept forward, their hands on their radios, ready to call for backup if needed. Peering around the side of the vehicle, they spotted her, the woman from the footage, still clutching her small dog, looking nervously around as if trying to decide her next move. Daniels stepped forward, her voice authoritative. "Ma'am, this is the police. We need you to come with us." The woman froze, her face contorting with anger and fear. "What? I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, clutching the dog tightly against her chest. "I'm the one who was in danger. That man was lurking in the mall, who knows what he was planning." Officer Grant raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, we've seen the footage. You approached him and used pepper spray on him without any provocation. We need you to come back to the security office so we can discuss this." But the woman wasn't listening. She took a step back, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. "You're just siding with him because he's, well, you know," she muttered, her voice dripping with contempt. Daniels took another step forward, her hand moving subtly toward her taser. "This isn't up for debate, ma'am. You assaulted an innocent man who was simply doing his job. Now, you can either come with us peacefully, or we'll have to take further action." The woman's face twisted in defiance. "You can't arrest me. I know my rights. I was just protecting myself." Grant exchanged a look with Daniels, both officers seeing the situation escalate before their eyes. "Ma'am, we don't want to use force," Daniels warned. "But if you don't cooperate, we'll have no choice." The woman's gaze hardened, and before either officer could react, she whipped out a canister of pepper spray from her handbag, holding it up defensively. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice shaking. Grant and Daniels both took a step back, hands moving to their belts. "Ma'am, drop the pepper spray. Now," Grant commanded. The woman's hand was trembling as she held up the canister, clearly unsure of her next move. But as she raised it slightly, Daniels moved swiftly, grabbing her arm and twisting it just enough to dislodge the spray. The woman gasped in shock, her grip on her dog loosening as she struggled against Daniels' hold. Grant moved in, securing her other arm and gently leading her to the ground. "This didn't have to be so difficult," he muttered, securing the handcuffs around her wrists. The woman continued to shout, her voice echoing off the walls of the garage. "This is police brutality. I'm the victim here. That man was threatening me." Daniels shook her head, unamused. "The footage tells a very different story, ma'am. Let's get you back inside so we can discuss this properly." Grant radioed back to Lewis, letting him know they had the suspect in custody. "We're bringing her to the security office now. Make sure Mr. Moore is okay to give a full statement," he instructed. Daniels kept a firm grip on the woman as they led her back through the empty mall. The entire time, the woman continued to protest, her voice growing shrill with indignation. "You people don't understand. I was just protecting myself." He looked like he was up to no good. Daniels didn't respond, her jaw set with determination. She'd heard it all before, these same excuses, this same misplaced sense of victimhood. But this time, there was proof, and they wouldn't let her get away with it. Back in the security office, Terrence looked up as they entered, a wave of relief washing over him as he saw her in handcuffs. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope that justice might actually be served. As the officers brought the woman into the security office, her protests grew louder, filling the small room with her defiant cries. She twisted her head around to glare at Terrence, who was seated nearby, his eyes still red and raw from the pepper spray. The security footage had captured her actions clearly, yet she clung to her version of the story as if her life depended on it. "This is an outrage," she screamed, her voice echoing in the confined space. "I was just protecting myself from him. You all saw how dangerous he looked." Officer Daniels maintained her composure, giving the woman a calm but stern look. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the footage. Your actions were unprovoked, and you assaulted an innocent man. We'll need you to sit down so we can get a full statement." She continued to struggle, her face red with anger. "You people just want to ruin my life over one little misunderstanding. I have a right to feel safe, don't I?" Carlos, who was still in the room with Terrence, shook his head in disbelief. "Misunderstanding? You attacked him for no reason, and now you're trying to play the victim." The woman ignored him, directing her gaze at Terrence. "I should have known better than to expect any of you to understand," she spat, her words laced with contempt. "I know you're kind, always causing trouble, thinking you can get away with anything." The room went silent as her words hung in the air, the officers and security guards exchanging uneasy glances. Terrence clenched his fists, his anger simmering but controlled. He had dealt with prejudice before, but this was something else entirely, a blatant, ugly display that was now being weaponized against him. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I was just doing my job. I didn't do anything to you." Officer Grant moved forward, his voice firm. "Ma'am, if you continue to insult Mr. Moore, we'll have to take further action. This is your last warning." The woman's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, sneering as she turned her gaze away. Officer Daniels pulled up a chair for her and motioned for her to sit. "Please take a seat, ma'am. We'll go through this step by step and get your statement." Reluctantly, the woman sat down, her hands still cuffed. She kept her head held high, her gaze defiant, but the smug confidence she'd shown earlier was now tempered with a hint of uncertainty. As Daniels began asking her questions, Terrence's mind drifted, the reality of the situation settling over him. This woman had attacked him, assaulted him, without a second thought, simply because she didn't think he belonged in her space. It was a story he knew all too well, a narrative that had played out countless times for countless people. But this time, there were witnesses, cameras, and a clear, undeniable record of what had happened. While Daniels took the woman's statement, Officer Grant turned his attention to Terrence. "Mr. Moore, if you're feeling up to it, we'd like to get your side of the story as well. You can take a moment if you need to." Terrence nodded, sitting up straighter. He felt a wave of exhaustion but pushed it aside, knowing that his testimony was crucial. He glanced at Carlos, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm ready," Terrence replied, his voice steady. He recounted everything he could remember, from the moment the woman approached him to the instant she sprayed him with the pepper spray. He described her tone, her body language, and her harsh words, painting a vivid picture of the encounter. Officer Grant listened attentively, jotting down notes and nodding occasionally. The woman listened to his account, her expression shifting between anger and discomfort. At one point, she interrupted, her voice sharp. "That's not how it happened. You're exaggerating." Officer Daniels held up a hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, you'll have your chance to speak. Right now, Mr. Moore is giving his statement. Please respect that." Terrence continued, his voice calm but filled with conviction. When he finished, Officer Grant thanked him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled this well, Mr. Moore. We'll do everything we can to make sure justice is served." The woman rolled her eyes, mumbling under her breath, "Justice, yeah, right." Her tone was filled with sarcasm, and the officers gave her a warning glance, which silenced her, at least for the moment. Officer Daniels turned to Officer Lewis. "We'll need to call in for additional support and take statements from all available witnesses. Carlos, would you be willing to provide a statement as well?" Carlos nodded eagerly. "Of course. I saw the whole thing. Terrence didn't do anything wrong. He was just minding his own business when she went after him." With Carlos's testimony, the picture became even clearer. The woman, who still hadn't revealed her name, grew increasingly agitated as the officers collected evidence and documented every detail. Her initial confidence had now given way to something closer to fear, though she tried to hide it beneath her sneering bravado. As the officers finished gathering statements, Officer Grant turned to Officer Daniels. "I'll head back to the precinct and start the paperwork. We've got enough to press charges." Daniels nodded, glancing at the woman. "You're going to be charged with assault, ma'am. There's enough evidence here to move forward with the case." The woman's face drained of color, and she began to stammer, her confidence evaporating entirely. "You can't be serious. I was just protecting myself. I have a right to feel safe." Daniel sighed, clearly having heard similar arguments many times before. "You used pepper spray on an innocent man. That's an assault, plain and simple. We have it all on video, and witnesses have corroborated his account. You're not the victim here, ma'am." Realizing the gravity of the situation, the woman began to plead, her voice laced with desperation. "Please, this has to be a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any harm. I don't know what came over me. It was a moment of panic." Daniel shook her head, her expression resolute. "That may be, but your actions have consequences. You're going to have to answer for what you did." The woman's pleas continued, but it was clear that neither the officers nor Terrence or Carlos were moved. This was no misunderstanding, no innocent mistake. It was a deliberate act of aggression, one rooted in deep-seated prejudice. As Officer Grant prepared to escort her to the patrol car, she made one last attempt to defend herself, her voice cracking. "You're all making a huge mistake. I didn't do anything wrong. He looked suspicious, that's all." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officers had heard enough, and they weren't about to let her talk her way out of the situation. Grant led her out of the security office, her protests fading as they moved down the hallway. Terrence watched them go, feeling a sense of relief but also a lingering sadness. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, hadn't asked for any of this. All he'd wanted was to do his job in peace. But now that it had happened, he was glad to see the woman held accountable. Carlos placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled that like a pro, man. She didn't know who she was messing with." Terrence managed a small smile. "Thanks, Carlos. I didn't expect something like this to happen tonight. Carlos nodded sympathetically. None of us did. But people like her, they can't keep getting away with it. I'm glad the officers saw her for what she is. Terrence took a deep breath, the weight of the ordeal settling over him. The night had been long, and he was exhausted, but he felt a renewed sense of resolve. This incident had shaken him, but it had also reminded him of the strength within him, and of the importance of standing up for himself. Welcome to a story hub dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here, we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us, like, comment, and subscribe to support the community and keep up with new stories each day. Back at the precinct, Officer Grant sat across from the woman in an interview room, observing her as she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her smug arrogance had faded, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the occasional clearing of her throat. She kept her gaze fixed on the table, refusing to look Grant in the eye. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to give your statement, Grant said, leaning forward, his voice firm but calm. You have the right to remain silent, but we've gathered plenty of evidence. So, this is your chance to explain yourself. She looked up, her eyes flickering with a mixture of defiance and fear. Explain myself? What's there to explain? I felt threatened. That man looked suspicious, and I panicked. Grant sighed, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. The security footage shows that Mr. Moore wasn't doing anything suspicious. He was simply cleaning the floors. You approached him, not the other way around. Her expression hardened, her mouth set in a stubborn line. You're twisting things around. I was simply acting in self-defense. Ma'am, you were the one who escalated the situation, Grant continued, his tone unyielding. Not only did you approach him, but you used pepper spray without any cause. That's not self-defense. It's assault. She opened her mouth to protest but stopped, realizing that she had nothing to say that could justify her actions. The weight of her actions seemed to dawn on her, if only for a brief moment. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, her voice softening. Look, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought he was up to no good. Grant raised an eyebrow, studying her closely. So, you assumed he was a threat based on what, exactly? The woman hesitated, her face flushing with embarrassment. I don't know. It was instinct. Instinct? Grant repeated, incredulous. Or maybe it was just your own bias. She bristled at his words, crossing her arms defensively. I'm not biased. I just felt uncomfortable, that's all. Grant let out a sigh, clearly unimpressed by her attempt to downplay her actions. He stood up, gathering his notes. The fact remains that you assaulted an innocent man, and now you're facing the consequences. If you want to change your statement, you'll have the chance to consult with a lawyer. But understand this, actions like yours aren't taken lightly. He left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts, the reality of her situation sinking in. Outside, Officer Daniels waited, glancing at Grant as he exited. How'd it go? Grant shook his head, a look of disappointment crossing his face. She's still trying to play the victim, saying it was just instinct. Daniel scoffed, rolling her eyes. Typical. They never want to admit it's anything more than a misunderstanding. She glanced down the hallway toward the holding area where Terrence was waiting to provide any additional information if necessary. How's Mr. Moore holding up? Grant nodded, glancing toward the hallway. Better, but I think he's still in shock. I don't think he expected anything like this to happen. He just wanted to do his job. They made their way to the waiting area, where Terrence sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He looked up as they approached, managing a small, grateful smile. "Thanks for everything, officers. I know this has been a lot of trouble." Daniels shook her head. "It's no trouble at all, Mr. Moore. You shouldn't have to put up with behavior like that." Terrence nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've dealt with prejudice before, but this was something else." She really thought she was in the right. Grant placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "People like her often do, but that doesn't mean they're above the law. We're here to make sure she answers for what she did." Carlos joined them, offering Terrence a warm smile. "Hey, man, let's get out of here. I think you've done more than enough tonight." Terrence nodded, visibly relieved. He stood up, shaking hands with both officers. "Thank you again. Really. You don't know how much it means to me." The officers nodded, watching as Terrence and Carlos walked out of the precinct together, disappearing into the night. A sense of satisfaction settled over Grant and Daniels. They knew they had done the right thing, but they also knew that for people like Terrence, this was an all-too-common experience. Meanwhile, back in the holding area, the woman sat alone, her initial bravado now a distant memory. She was facing a long night ahead, and the beginning of a legal battle she hadn't anticipated. After leaving the precinct, Terrence and Carlos walked in silence down the quiet street. The city lights cast a warm glow over the sidewalks, their footsteps echoing faintly as they moved further from the police station. For a moment, Terrence just let the cool night air calm him, feeling the events of the past few hours slowly melt away. He glanced at Carlos, giving him a grateful nod. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." Carlos waved his hand dismissively, but his smile was sincere. "Man, you don't have to thank me. That woman was out of line, and you didn't deserve any of it." He shook his head, frustration clear in his voice. "I just can't believe people still act that way. I mean, it's 2024. Haven't we moved past this?" Terrence sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You'd think so, but some things never seem to change." His voice was tinged with exhaustion, but there was also a quiet resilience that had carried him through situations like this before. "I just try to stay focused, keep my head down." But tonight, he trailed off, shaking his head. Carlos put a hand on Terrence's shoulder, his gaze filled with determination. "Tonight was different because you had to stand up for yourself. That woman thought she could walk all over you, but look how it turned out. She's sitting in a cell, and you're free." They continued walking, the city bustling with life even as the night wore on. The sounds of honking cars and distant conversations filled the air, a comforting reminder of normalcy in the wake of the evening's events. They stopped at a small diner, the neon sign flickering over the entrance, casting a soft glow across the tables inside. Carlos gestured toward the door, grinning. "What do you say we grab some coffee? I think we've earned it." Terrence chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Coffee sounds perfect." They stepped into the diner, the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling food welcoming them. They found a booth near the back, settling into the cushioned seats as a waitress came over, placing menus in front of them. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get you?" she asked, her voice warm and friendly. Carlos smiled. "2 coffees, please. And maybe a slice of pie if you have it." She nodded, jotting down their order before disappearing into the kitchen. As they waited, Carlos leaned forward, his expression serious. "So, what's next for you, man? You gonna press charges?" Terrence hesitated, his fingers tracing patterns on the edge of the table. "I don't know. Part of me wants to just let it go, forget the whole thing ever happened." He sighed, his gaze distant. "But another part of me feels like I need to stand up, not just for myself, but for everyone who deals with this kind of thing." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "You've got every right to pursue this, Terrence. People like her don't get held accountable nearly enough, and if you take a stand, maybe she'll think twice next time. Maybe other people like her will, too. Terence nodded, his expression softening as he considered Carlos's words. You're probably right. I never wanted this kind of attention. I just wanted to do my job. Carlos gave him a reassuring smile. Hey, whatever you decide, I've got your back. Their conversation was interrupted as the waitress returned, setting down 2 steaming cups of coffee and a slice of apple pie between them. They thanked her, taking a moment to savor the warmth of the coffee, the rich flavor a welcome comfort after a difficult night. As they ate, their conversation drifted to lighter topics, memories of past jobs, funny stories from work, and dreams for the future. Carlos shared his goal of one day opening his own restaurant, a dream he'd held onto since he was a teenager. Terence listened, his spirits lifted by Carlos's enthusiasm. But the reality of the night's events lingered, and after a while, their conversation circled back to what had happened. Terence took a deep breath, looking across the table at Carlos. You know, I think I'm going to press charges. Not for revenge, but to make a point. People like her need to realize that they can't treat others like that and walk away without consequences. Carlos's face broke into a broad smile. That's what I'm talking about. You're doing the right thing, Terence. That woman's probably used to getting away with this kind of stuff, but not this time. They finished their coffee, the warmth of their conversation easing the tension in Terence's chest. By the time they left the diner, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, his resolve stronger than before. As they stepped back into the cool night air, Carlos clapped him on the back. Let's get you home, man. It's been a long night. The 2 friends walked in companionable silence, the city lights casting a comforting glow over them. As they neared Terence's apartment, Carlos turned to him, a mischievous glint in his eye. You know, if you ever need backup again, I'm just a phone call away. Terence laughed, shaking his head. Thanks, Carlos. I'll keep that in mind. They said their goodbyes, and Terence made his way upstairs, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up with him. He unlocked the door, stepping into the quiet of his apartment. He paused, taking a deep breath, letting the silence wash over him. It was a comforting contrast to the chaos he'd faced earlier, a reminder that he was home, safe. As he prepared for bed, his mind replayed the events of the evening. He thought of the woman, her face twisted in anger and arrogance, her words laced with venom. He felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let her actions define him. Tomorrow, he would make the call, begin the process of pressing charges. It wasn't an easy decision, but he knew it was the right one. The next morning, he awoke to the sun streaming through his window, casting a warm glow over his room. He lay there for a moment, letting the events of the night before settle in his mind. The fear, the anger, it all seemed distant now, replaced by a calm sense of resolve. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for the precinct. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button, but then he pressed it, bringing the phone to his ear. A receptionist answered, her voice bright and professional. Hello, this is Terence Moore. I'd like to follow up on a case from last night and speak with someone about filing charges. The receptionist transferred him, and a familiar voice came on the line, Officer Grant. Mr. Moore, Grant greeted him warmly. I was hoping you'd call. How can I assist you today? Terence took a deep breath. I've decided to move forward with pressing charges against the woman who assaulted me. I think it's the right thing to do. Grant's voice was filled with encouragement. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Moore. We'll make sure everything is handled properly, and I'll walk you through each step of the process. You're doing something important here. They went over the details, Grant outlining the next steps. Terence listened carefully, his confidence growing with each word. By the time he ended the call, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination that went beyond his own personal experience. Terence knew that by standing up for himself, he was taking a stand for others who had faced similar prejudice. He couldn't change the world in a day, but he could do his part to ensure that, this time, justice was served. A few days later, Terence sat in his apartment, gathering his thoughts before heading to the precinct for his first official meeting with the lawyer assigned to his case. The decision to press charges had set a chain of events into motion, and although he was nervous, he knew it was the right step. The precinct had been supportive, connecting him with advocates and legal experts who assured him they would handle the case thoroughly. He grabbed his bag, his hands steady with determination, and made his way to the station. When he arrived, he saw Officer Grant and another familiar face waiting for him, Carlos, who had insisted on accompanying him. "Thought I'd lend a bit of moral support," Carlos said with a grin, giving Terence a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Together, they entered the precinct, where they were greeted by Officer Daniels. "Terence, it's good to see you." "And Carlos," she added with a nod. "The lawyer's waiting for you in the conference room. We're ready when you are." Taking a deep breath, Terence followed her down the hallway and into the room, where a tall, well-dressed man stood to greet him. The lawyer introduced himself as Mr. Barnes, his handshake firm and professional. "Mr. Moore, it's an honor to represent you. Let's make sure justice is served." They sat down, and Mr. Barnes quickly began explaining the legal process, outlining what they could expect in the coming weeks. "We have a strong case," he assured Terence. "With the evidence from security footage and witness statements, we can demonstrate that this was an unprovoked assault." Listening to Mr. Barnes's calm and precise explanation, Terence felt his anxiety ease slightly. He appreciated the straightforward approach, the assurance that this case wouldn't be swept under the rug. The clarity of it all reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time since the incident, he felt a flicker of hope that his stand might truly make a difference. "Now," Mr. Barnes continued, "the charges we're pursuing will likely lead to court hearings, and that means we'll need your full cooperation to make the strongest case possible. Are you prepared to give a formal statement today?" Terence nodded, determination in his voice. "I am. Let's get this on record." They spent the next few hours going over the events of that night in detail. Terence described his routine at work, the moment he noticed the woman approaching, and the horrifying instant when she sprayed him. He recalled every detail, each word spoken, each movement. When he finished, he felt a weight lift, knowing that his account was now documented and ready for the proceedings ahead. Carlos, who had been sitting in the back of the room, listening intently, nodded approvingly. "You handled that like a pro, man," he said with a grin. Officer Grant and Daniels were equally supportive, with Grant reassuring him, "You've taken a big step today, Terence. This is exactly what needs to happen to hold people accountable." As they exited the conference room, Daniels leaned in to give Terence some advice. "I won't lie, things might get challenging from here. Cases like this don't always go smoothly. But don't let that discourage you. We're all here to support you." Terence thanked her, appreciating the encouragement. On the drive home with Carlos, he felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The initial fear that had plagued him since the incident was fading, replaced by a sense of empowerment. He was no longer just a victim, he was now an advocate for justice. The days turned into weeks as preparations for the case unfolded. Terence met with Mr. Barnes several more times to review the evidence, preparing for every possible question or strategy the defense might use. The Karen, as many had begun to refer to her behind closed doors, was apparently well known in certain circles for her aggressive behavior, though none of her past actions had led to charges before. She'd always managed to talk her way out of trouble, but this time was different. The evidence was too strong, and public support for Terence's case grew rapidly once the media caught wind of it. News outlets began reporting on the incident, covering it as another unfortunate example of racial bias in America. Terrence's story resonated with viewers, and people across the country voiced their support. Interviews, articles, and social media discussions blossomed around the case, with people expressing outrage and calling for justice. Though he'd never sought fame, Terrence understood that this attention could serve a greater purpose. With every interview he gave, he emphasized the importance of standing up against prejudice. He spoke candidly about the incident, sharing his story in the hope that it would inspire others to do the same. It was an unexpected twist, but he embraced it, grateful for the platform he now had. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, Terrence stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by a crowd of supporters. Carlos stood by his side, along with Officer Daniels and a few members of the community who had come out to show their support. The sight of so many people rallying behind him filled him with a profound sense of purpose. As they entered the courtroom, Terrence was surprised to see a sea of faces in the audience. Supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the seats, all eager to witness the proceedings. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he prepared to face the woman who had turned his life upside down. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and the preliminary hearing began. Mr. Barnes presented the evidence with skill and precision, outlining the events leading up to the assault and emphasizing the unprovoked nature of the attack. The defense tried to argue that their client had acted in self-defense, but the security footage painted a different story, leaving little room for doubt. Terrence watched as the woman sat at the defense table, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. She seemed to struggle with the reality that, for once, she couldn't talk her way out of the situation. Her body language was tense, her face pale as she listened to the evidence against her. It was clear that she hadn't anticipated the overwhelming support for Terrence, nor had she expected the case to gain such public attention. As the hearing progressed, witnesses took the stand to share their accounts of the incident. Some were co-workers who attested to Terrence's dedication and professionalism, while others were residents who spoke about the impact his work had on the building's community. Their words painted a picture of a man who was hardworking, trustworthy, and deeply respected, a stark contrast to the defense's attempts to cast doubt on his character. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence for the case to go to trial. Terrence felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. The journey wasn't over, but they had cleared the first hurdle. Outside the courthouse, Terrence was greeted by an outpouring of support from the crowd. People cheered, clapping and chanting his name as he emerged. He looked around, overwhelmed by the show of solidarity, and raised his hand in acknowledgement. This case had become bigger than him, bigger than a single incident of injustice. It had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up for one's rights. Carlos nudged him, grinning. "You did it, man. You're making history here." Terrence smiled, feeling a new sense of pride. For so long, he had been content to go unnoticed, to do his job quietly and without fanfare. But now he understood that sometimes, standing up was necessary, not just for himself, but for the countless others who faced similar injustices. As he stood among the crowd, surrounded by friends and strangers alike, Terrence felt an unshakable resolve. The trial was still ahead, and there would be challenges to come, but he knew that he wasn't alone. And as he looked out at the sea of faces supporting him, he felt a deep sense of purpose, a purpose that transcended his own personal struggle. The trial date arrived sooner than Terrence expected. He stood outside the courthouse that morning, steadying himself with a deep breath. Carlos was by his side, along with Officer Daniels and Mr. Barnes, who gave him a reassuring nod. As they walked into the courthouse, he was greeted by familiar faces of supporters, each one reminding him that he wasn't alone. Inside the courtroom, he took his seat at the plaintiff's table, while across from him sat the woman who had pepper-sprayed him. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. It was a stark contrast to the confident, aggressive persona she'd displayed that night in the hallway. Terrence felt a strange sense of closure as he watched her shift uncomfortably in her seat. The proceedings began with opening statements from both sides. Mr. Barnes started, describing the assault and emphasizing the blatant aggression. This was a clear case of assault and racial harassment, targeted against a man simply doing his job. Terrence Moore, a dedicated and hardworking janitor, was treated as less than human by this woman, who felt she could use force to assert her authority. The defense attorney attempted to paint the situation as a misunderstanding, arguing that the woman had felt threatened and acted out of instinct. However, as Mr. Barnes presented the security footage, her narrative began to unravel. The video clearly showed her approaching Terrence, her face twisted in anger, and the sudden, unprovoked spray of pepper spray directly into his eyes. It left little room for misinterpretation. The witnesses took the stand next. First was a resident from the apartment complex, who had seen the incident from down the hallway. She described how she had heard the woman yelling before seeing her raise her hand with the pepper spray canister. She looked furious, the witness said. I remember thinking, what did he do to deserve that? But he hadn't done anything. He was just working. Her testimony left a powerful impression on the jury, underscoring the unprovoked nature of the attack. Other co-workers of Terrence testified as well, each one affirming his character, dedication, and respectful nature. They painted a vivid picture of a man who took pride in his work and treated everyone with kindness. By the time they finished, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Terrence was a man of integrity, and the defense's attempts to tarnish his reputation were futile. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Terrence took the stand. He spoke calmly and sincerely about that night, recounting the shock and pain he felt as the pepper spray hit his eyes. His voice wavered slightly as he described the fear and humiliation he'd experienced, but he held himself steady, determined to share his story without faltering. When Mr. Barnes asked him how the incident had affected him, Terrence took a deep breath. It's not just about what happened to me, he said. It's about what people like me go through every day. The feeling that, no matter how hard we work, someone will see us as less than. That someone will think they have the right to hurt us simply because they can. The courtroom was silent as his words sank in. The jury members watched him intently, clearly moved by his testimony. It was a powerful moment, and as Terrence stepped down from the stand, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had told his story. Whatever the outcome, he knew he'd done his part. The defense called their client to the stand, hoping to salvage the case. She attempted to appear remorseful, claiming that she'd felt scared and hadn't meant to harm him. But her words lacked sincerity, and her tone betrayed a lingering arrogance that didn't sit well with the jury. Mr. Barnes's cross-examination was sharp and unyielding, exposing inconsistencies in her story and forcing her to admit that she'd never actually felt threatened. When closing arguments began, Mr. Barnes delivered a final, compelling statement. He reminded the jury of the evidence, the testimonies, and the importance of holding people accountable. This is about justice, he concluded. Justice for Terrence, and for every person who has faced discrimination while simply trying to live their life with dignity. The defense's closing statement was lackluster in comparison, relying on pleas for leniency and claims of misunderstanding. By the time the jury retired to deliberate, it was clear which way the case was leaning. Terrence waited anxiously with Carlos, Daniels, and Mr. Barnes by his side. They shared quiet words of support, each one expressing confidence in the outcome. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned, and the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. A wave of relief washed over Terrence as the words sank in. Carlos patted him on the back, grinning, while Daniels nodded approvingly. Mr. Barnes shook his hand, a look of satisfaction in his eyes. Justice had been served. The judge handed down the sentence, ordering the woman to complete a series of community service hours and mandating racial sensitivity training as part of her punishment. It wasn't a long prison sentence, but it was a strong statement, one that would hopefully serve as a deterrent for others who thought they could act without consequence. Outside the courthouse, Terrence was met with a crowd of supporters, journalists, and well-wishers. As he stood before them, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't known before. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated or belittled. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady and strong. Today isn't just a victory for me. It's a victory for everyone who's been told they don't belong, who's been made to feel less than because of who they are. It's a reminder that we all deserve respect and dignity, no matter what we look like or where we come from. The crowd erupted into applause, people cheering and holding up signs of support. Carlos pulled him into a hug, grinning from ear to ear. "You did it, man. You made a difference." In the days that followed, Terrence's story continued to spread, inspiring conversations about discrimination and accountability. People across the country reached out to him, sharing their own stories and expressing their gratitude for his courage. The media dubbed him a hero of justice, a title he accepted humbly, grateful for the impact his story had made. As time passed, Terrence returned to his job, but things felt different. People greeted him with newfound respect, and he felt a deeper connection to his community. He knew that he had become more than just a janitor, he had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Every so often, he would cross paths with a supporter or receive a letter from someone inspired by his story. And each time, he was reminded of the journey he had taken, the courage it had required, and the change he had helped bring about. It wasn't an easy road, but he knew he had done the right thing. And, with a quiet sense of satisfaction, he continued forward, knowing that he had made a lasting difference in the world.